Meeting of the Middletown Township Historical Society. Thank you for coming out, and we welcome Dr. Stanley Blair as a return speaker. Dr. Blair, who holds a PhD from Duke University, is associate professor at Monmouth University, has held numerous posts in the Department of English, and teaches varied courses on English, literature, and popular culture. I'm not aware if Monmouth County is a specialty of his, but some of his best presentations are on Monmouth County, as those of you who heard him speak on Henry Morford right here in our New Monmouth neighborhood know. Tonight he is going to talk about one of the most historic places in Middletown Township. Yes, Sandy Hook is part of Middletown Township, and the literature of the area. So, Dr. Blair, please take over.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Tom. I appreciate it. Thank you all for coming out this evening. So let's see. Wrong way? Oh, pointing back. I'm going the wrong way. Okay, thank you. It should have taken me less than a minute, tops, to hand over the ledger. I was meeting outside of this library to return Peter Van Nortwick's generous loan of a mid-1850s store ledger with the assistance of Tom Valenti, who offered to bring the ledger to Peter. However, when one thinks and talks about the past, as Tom and I were doing, time's mathematical progression can recede and fade. At that time, I had recently presented on Chanceville's Henry Morford, and Tom had graciously invited me back for a future presentation. Now, I had taught a graduate course about northern coastal Monmouth County literature as far back as spring 2011, and I was interested in dusting off some of that literature and giving it another look. So I raised to Tom a possible presentation on literature pertaining to Sandy Hook. I noted, as I also do now for our online audience, that Sandy Hook is a part of Middletown Township, as Randy said. Middletown was once a much larger township than it is today, before Bayshore communities such as Highlands seceded in the early 20th century and left Sandy Hook non-contiguous, detached. Tom seemed surprised that I, not a Middletown native, knew that about Sandy Hook. And he seemed surprised at my claim that a lot of literature had been written about Sandy Hook. So from my course reading list, I started rattling off to Tom about 10 authors' names. Some of them still well known today, some important in their day, but forgotten now, and others quite obscure and now totally forgotten. That's how literary history is. There were more than those I named, I told Tom, and my presentation could talk about each of them just a little. However, I could tell Tom was impressed by the names of some of the better known authors. So I made a counteroffer. I could focus on one author, I told Tom, having one of them in mind, the one who will appear last tonight. However, Tom did not want me to choose just one author either, which might have been too focused. So finally, I suggested a compromise. A David Letterman-like top 10 list, which would allow me to spend a little time on some authors and more on others. To this, Tom agreed. Meanwhile, time had passed, by the clock at least, much more than the 1 minute on which I had planned. Actually, as we were discussing things, an hour had passed. The sun had set, the overhead parking lot lights had come on, and the library staff had not only exited the library and locked the front doors, but had stared at us and then driven away. So by the end, Tom and I were left discussing the literature of Sandy Hook in an empty parking lot. Thus concluded, inauspiciously, the first version of this talk. I'm grateful to Tom for his interest, patience, and guidance, and especially for his generosity in letting me talk again about the literature of Sandy Hook in a venue that is not an empty parking lot. First, some parameters that guide what follows. The title is not Sandy Hook Writers, with good reason. We might distinguish among birth, residency, and visiting status. Being born in a particular place or even being raised there does not necessarily mean any attachment into adulthood. Some writers intentionally avoid writing about where they were born or raised. As for residents, though they may live in a place for many years and so may describe it accurately, they do not have exclusive rights to literary depictions of it. This is because visitors to a place sometimes perceive and experience things that its residents do not. This is especially true in a tourist area because visitors have a geographically more widely distributed understanding of that same place that might be understood as its public reputation. As for applying all of this to Sandy Hook, relatively few people have been born or have resided on Sandy Hook, and even fewer of those have been writers. So, unlike many places, much of what may be called the literature of Sandy Hook was written by nearby authors who visited or by tourists who were just passing through. Also, my top 10 list is biased because I'm interested in the history of literature, which means my list may not make it very far into the 20th century, let alone the 21st. So I'm going to start with some honorable mentions. They are truly honorable in the sense that my excluding them from my top 10 list is not a judgment of quality or of value, but based solely on their being recent. Readers interested in Sandy Hook in recent years should consult these works. No doubt this list of honorable mentions overlooks some other worthy late 20th and early 21st century authors and works. And so to it, one may always add. This chronological bias creates another issue, geographical in nature, which is that historical Middletown up until 1900 included areas immediately adjoining Sandy Hook, such as Highlands and the mouth of the Shrewsbury River. Thus, some literary works might have made this work, but they were not about Sandy Hook. They were rather about Highlands as an independent municipality. Their works are also worth exploring, but the chronological and geographical narrowness of tonight's theme excludes them. To this list, I belatedly add John P. King's 2012 collection, Stories from Highlands, New Jersey. And so, to the top 10 list. Coming in at number 10, Thomas Fleming Day's poem, The Cargo Boats, from his 1898 book, Songs of Sea and Sail. A feature of Sandy Hook historically has been its national usefulness on the one hand for federal military purposes, and on the other hand, as a federal recreation area. That is, Sandy Hook is distinctive because it can be valued in two ways for its utilitarian value and its aesthetic value. This contrast is the theme of Day's poem, which presents it in terms of nautical propulsion. He prefers sail over steam, and by extension, he prefers nature over technology. To give you a little of the poem, I feel the spirit of the age, the master splendor of its span, but make no common with the rage that lifts the thing above the man. But useless this, we've learned to make the word mechanic fit a song. So let us watch that ship and take her picture as she jogs along. Using a photographic metaphor, take her picture for writing a poem. The poem speaker then watches a steamboat travel north through the bay near Sandy Hook. According to anthologist Eugene Musgrove, Day said the poem was suggested by a view from the Highlands. As the boat clears Sandy Hook, the poem provides a twist. The hook is past, the buoy abeam, then slowly to her helm she turns, and gaining confidence and steam at full speed up the bay she churns. Her lean hull shrinks, her spars grow short, her trailing flag is scarcely seen, as slipping past the granite fort, she drops her hook off quarantine. And we who watch her turn away and talk of ships and other things, the present and the future day, and what the world will do with wings, how men will stir with busy hum the upper main by wake untraced, and how the ocean will become again a sailless, shipless waste. What the world will do with wings is referring to traveling through the air, the upper main, only a few years before the Wright brothers' success at Kitty Hawk. The speaker's point is not just that he prefers the good old days of sailboats over then modern steamboats, but it is also that just as sailboats were made obsolete by steamboats, steamboats will be made obsolete by aircraft. This technological progress may be symbolized through the ship's journey along Sandy Hook until it reaches quarantine. Coming in at number 9, one of the better known poets on the list, Philip Freneau of Matawan, and his 1791 poem, Never Sink. Variously spelled and pronounced, Never Sink, Navesink, or Navesink, is the name of the highlands or hills southwest of Sandy Hook, from which it is often viewed. Among Freneau's other activities as a printer, he was a prolific and influential poet of occasional poems about the Revolutionary War and later of romantic poems about nature. He is sometimes called the poet of the American Revolution and the grandfather of American poetry. However, his poem Never Sink cannot merit a higher spot on this list. While it's lovely and enthusiastic, and technically it includes some of Middletown Township, the poem focuses on the view between the hilltop and the sea. Sandy Hook is mentioned only by general implication through coastal references such as the first stanzas, this rude resounding shore, and the last stanzas, tenacious of the shore. Number 8 is a poet from Atlantic Highlands, George Arnold, with 2 poems from his 1867 book, Poems Grave and Gay. The June 24th, 1859 poem announces that date, announces that date is Arnold's 25th birthday. Set on the Navesink Highlands like Day's and Freneau's poems, the poem's speaker looks a long distance at Sandy Hook and the sea from a great height. This gets him thinking about the passage of time. The poem begins, I see the surf on Sandy Hook, I see the bay below me spread, and here I lie with pipe and book and the blue sky overhead. The poem goes on to describe signs of his premature aging, such as gray hair and wrinkles, and to suggest they are there because his soul is old. The second poem, The Cruise of the Flora, is a self-described nautical ballad, not about Sandy Hook, but about sailing to a hunting trip on Barnegat Bay. The poem mentions Arnold's itinerary, Barnegat Inlet, Manahawkin, Tuckerton, Egg Harbor, Little Egg, but the trip ends as it begins, near Sandy Hook. Quote, our skipper steered for one thing straight, the buoy behind the bar. All night our northward course we lay, till off the first hook light, whereas we hankered for the day, we anchored for the night. So on the return trip, Arnold's boat swings around the same navigational feature noted by Day in his poem, the buoy marking the Sandy Hook sandbar. Arnold seems also to refer to the older main light, the lighthouse on Sandy Hook, the first hook light, which would have been visible where they anchored. In the next stanza, the next morning, the poem speaker says, we reached our home, consistent with Arnold living in Atlantic Highlands. At number 7 is a poet from Texas who published 3 poems mentioning Sandy Hook in his 1893 book, Ranch Verses, William Lawrence Chittenden. Ranch Verses consists of poems he wrote in Texas, and as he traveled around the country. Like some of the other poems we have seen, the poem Shrewsbury River mentions the passage of time, noting that the river has flowed since long before the birth of Moses, and referencing Native Americans as well as Henry Hudson. Sandy Hook, and specifically Horseshoe Cove, are mentioned in a couple of lines. Quote, "Yachtsmen gay and weary seamen, love thy horseshoe harbor rest." Similarly, the poem Highland Evening Song does not reference Sandy Hook, but does compare the flowing of the Shrewsbury River into Sandy Hook Bay to earthly life and eternity. Chittenden's note to the third poem, The Squall Off Sandy Hook, NJ, indicates the poem was inspired by a real incident aboard the sloop yacht Murtis in the summer of 1892. The line, quote, "Our stanch sloop reels past the Bell Boy Brown," suggests the yacht has rounded Sandy Hook into the ocean, heading south, just as it is hit by sudden blast of onshore wind, rain, and waves. The wind blows towards Sandy Hook, which is to the west of the yacht. The wind blows from the ocean, which is to the east. To quote the poem, "On the leeward bow is Sandy Hook, to the windward far the white waves are white. In the lap of night, the highlands look like some huge sea snake with eyes of light." The eyes of light seem to refer to the twin lights, as seen from near Sandy Hook. After the squall, the twin lights look less serpentine and more inviting. Quote, "Across the bay, twin beacons beam and glow o'er the Navesink Highland town." Author number 6 is from Middletown, born and raised in Chancellorsville, Henry Morford. A prolific novelist, travel writer, poet, and dramatist, he wrote a poem set on Sandy Hook and then referred to Sandy Hook directly in his first travel guide. The poem, originally entitled A Song of the Wreck, refers to a geographical feature of Sandy Hook, which is that at some times in the 18th and 19th centuries, it was a peninsula, and at other times an island, separated from the northern part of Seabright, then Wardle's Beach, by what was then called Shrewsbury Inlet. According to anthologist Eugene Musgrove, who reprinted the poem under a different title, A Wreck in Shrewsbury Inlet, Morford noted, "The Liverpool packet ship North America, wrecked in Shrewsbury Inlet about 1842, remained many years in sight. Some of her timbers were rediscovered in 1875 or 1876. The poem begins by describing the wreck being embedded in the beach. The ocean sands are round her keel, and there's a seagull on the deck. The poem ends by contrasting the ship fighting the seas with it now fighting erosion on the beach. From the poem, "Battle she not? Aye, gallantly, and plank by plank is swept away slowly, as if she could not be a trophy yielded to decay." According to Woolman and Rose's 1878 Historical and Biographical Atlas of the New Jersey coast, Shrewsbury Inlet closed for the last time on 8 July 1848. This makes the poem's likely composition date between then and the poem's publication in Morford's 1859 collection, Rhymes of 20 Years. As for Morford's 1867 travel book, Oversea, it refers to the area around Sandy Hook. Quote, "That long, pleasant, heaving swell which meets the steamer at the point of the hook." And then continues, quoting Morford again, "What a glorious golden summer afternoon was that when the first blue hills of Navesink and the Long Island shores faded away behind us, when we slowed engine to put the spry little pilot down into his cockle shell of a boat and sent back by him our last penciled words of remembrance to loved ones." By mentioning the pilot, Morford references quite an old institution named for Sandy Hook, an institution that started in the late 1600s and continues to the present day. The Sandy Hook pilots, who assist ocean-going vessels between Sandy Hook and Rockaway in and out of New York Harbor. I believe they're based in Staten Island now. At number 5 is an author who's distinctive because she appears to have lived on Sandy Hook. Marion Rolfe Johnson Dietrich, who in 1930 published under the pseudonym of Jacqueline Dietrich a coming-of-age novel entitled Parade Ground. The protagonist is Janet Custis, who is sometimes called Jan or Janny. Her father is an officer in a coastal artillery unit. Janet and her father moved from California to the Philippines, then an unincorporated US territory, and then to a place called Fort Jonathan Wade, W-A-Y-D-E, where Janet's father teaches in a school for the coastal artillery. See if you recognize what this sounds like. At the fort, there is a row of buildings called Waterfront Row, behind which is a grassy area, then a line of artillery batteries, and then the sea. One gets around these unpaved parts of the base on horses. Waterfront Row includes white pillared houses, the pillars being repeatedly referred to. I found at least 5 references. The houses are also pink bricked. At such a house, one goes up steps to a porch with a swing, a popular place for people to gather. One enters the building through a screen door to a hallway, off of which there is a study. Stairs lead up to at least a second floor where there is a living room with a fireplace. Evidently, also upstairs are at least 4 bedrooms. The houses are lined up along a concrete beach road, and beyond them, there is an old fortress and a parade ground. The fort also includes barracks, a road through those, and a post exchange. The fort is accessed via, quote, a long natural pass that linked Fort Jonathan Wade to its flat coast. The fort is also separated by water from what the narrator calls the mainland. The nearest mainland town is called Calhoun, where there are willow trees and a country club. One passes through Calhoun on the way between the fort and another town called Huffolk, H-U-F-F-O-L-K, where young people go to get drunk, and where there's also a country club. One gets to Huffolk by driving down Waterfront Road, evidently south, past sweet potato fields to a ferry. Fort Jonathan Wade also appears to be near New York City. Jan is always wanting to go there. A reference to the arrival of the Jazz Age suggests that at least initially, the time of the novel setting is approximately the early 1920s. Now, I'm still rereading Dietrich's novel and assembling its fictional geography. However, quite apart from matters of character and plot, which tend to focus on coming-of-age transgressions such as romance and drinking, the novel's setting of fictional Fort Jonathan Wade resembles real Fort Hancock. Coming in at number 4 is a relatively unknown author, George Washington Wright Houghton. In 1868, according to J.H. Schenk's Guide to Long Branch, Houghton was a florist specializing in exotic gardens, with a shop at 125 Main Street in Long Branch. Schenk notes that Houghton had arrived in the area 10 years earlier, bought several acres and landscaped them beautifully, creating pathways for carriages to drive through, a mini botanical garden. Schenk goes on to praise Houghton, recommending him, quote, to all co-admirers of the true, the beautiful, and the good. Houghton makes this Sandy Hook list for 2 works he wrote in 1879, a poem and a nonfiction article, both entitled Sandy Hook. The poem Sandy Hook appears in his 1882 collection, Niagara and Other Poems. A note to the poem says that it was inspired by or written at the main light, the Sandy Hook Lighthouse, in July 1879. The poem begins by describing a beach scene. White sand and cedars, sands, lighthouses here and there, a strand strewn over with driftwood, tangled weeds, a squad of fishhawks poised above the nets, too anxious-eyed to move, flame-flowering cactus, winged seeds that on a sea of sunshine lie unfanned, saved by some butterfly. The detail of the flowering cactus seems particularly apt for a florist poet who specialized in exotic gardens. The poem moves on almost predictably to consider the passage of time. The waves are, quote, old as the years, as the afternoon passes. And at sunset, the moon becomes visible. As the wind shifts on shore, the poem becomes more ominous. I'm quoting again. Hoarse foghorns shout a warning, and in gathering gloom against the sea's white anger loom tall shapes of wreckers, torch in hand, rattling their lifeboats down the sand. Wreckers are local residents who salvage things from wrecks. Here the wreckers appear as if in anticipation of a shipwreck, though I confess to some uncertainty about calling their boats lifeboats. However, Houghton's main claim to Sandy Hook literary fame is not this poem, but his illustrated article, Sandy Hook, in the September 1879 Scribner's Magazine. If one wants to experience what Sandy Hook was like a century and a half ago, Houghton's article is essential reading. His article begins, "Every American knows Sandy Hook by name." The article then surveys Sandy Hook's early history, from Robert Jewett's 1609 diary entry to Richard Hartshorn's purchase of the area and negotiations with Native Americans just after his 1669 arrival, to the idea of a beacon or lighthouse in 1761 and 1762. Houghton notes that from 1762 onward, a portion of Sandy Hook was annexed to New York. The historical survey continues into the construction of the main light, the lighthouse on Sandy Hook, and the events of the Revolutionary War, mentioning the order never carried out to destroy the lighthouse to prevent a British invasion. The article then turns to the topic of Sandy Hook being alternately an island and a peninsula, before providing an account of a walking tour from Horseshoe Cove down to the Highland Drawbridge. Houghton's account mentions, among other details, the boiler testing grounds, Spermaceti Cove, Captain Kidd's tree, the seagulls, the insects and snakes, and the life-saving station, as well as the two lightships offshore. Houghton then turns north to the main light and describes it and the salvaged items and hills around it. He continues to what he calls the Ocean Cemetery, and then to the barracks and fort. Houghton gives the total population of Sandy Hook at about 100 people, half of them near the military facilities and the other half living near Horseshoe Cove, mainly railroad and steamboat employees. Of the latter, Houghton says, they, quote, are jocosely called sand hillers, and a strangely isolated community they make up, with no post office, no church, no physician, no policeman, no fireman, and only one store. That a floating one, moored to the steamboat dock. The last stop on Houghton's walking tour is the 70-foot tower of the Western Union Telegraph Company, then becoming obsolete due to the ocean cable. Formerly, the company used a carrier pigeon to relay European news from ships offshore to the Sandy Hook office that then telegraphed the news to the city. Houghton's article provides a uniquely comprehensive view of Sandy Hook in both time and space, something other authors did not accomplish. And so, though he's unknown, he merits a relatively high spot on this list. At number 3, the famous poet Walt Whitman. Correction. Poet and prose writer Walt Whitman. Some of his prose writings mention Sandy Hook and may be found in his 1882 book, Specimen Days and Collect. In one passage dated June 25th, 1878, Whitman writes, "Out today on the waters for a sail in the wide bay, southeast of Staten Island, a rough tossing ride and a free sight, the long stretch of Sandy Hook, the highlands of Navesink, and the many vessels outward and inward bound. We came up through the midst of all in the full sun." A year later, in September or early October of 1879, he seems to recall a second voyage. Quote, "Not long ago, I was down New York Bay on a steamer, watching the sunset over the dark green heights of Navesink and viewing all that inimitable spread of shore, shipping, and sea around Sandy Hook." 2 other passages put him near Sandy Hook on June 4th, 1880, and on board the steamer Plymouth Rock on July 25th, 1881 at 9:30 a.m. That's a total of 4 prose references to Sandy Hook and the hills in the space of 4 years, 1878 to 1881. Perhaps no surprise then as a poet, Whitman wrote poems about the area around Sandy Hook. There are 8 of them in a sequence entitled Fancies at Navesink. They were first printed in the British magazine, The 19th Century, in August 1885, and later integrated into the Sands at 70 section of his book, Leaves of Grass. While the poems seem to refer to some of the places he visited around 1880, 1881, and thus reflect memories, one cannot exclude the possibility that he made yet another trip to the area around Sandy Hook between then and 1885. Sadly, other than the title, the poems contain no specific reference to Sandy Hook or the area around it. Also, contrary to young Walt Whitman's Song of Myself, Section 6, in which the poem speaker famously proclaims there is no such thing as death, in Fancies at Navesink, old man Walt Whitman sees death differently. There is ambivalence reflected by the tides going out and coming back, the oscillation suggesting that death is associated with low tide and life with high tide, all the while in the background, the great ocean of eternity. The final poem, the 8th one in the sequence, Then Last of All, perhaps alludes to the shores of Sandy Hook. And here is that poem. Then last of all, caught from these shores, this hill, of you, O tides, the mystic human meaning. Only by law of you, your swell and ebb, enclosing me the same, the brain that shapes, the voice that chants this song. Okay. Number 2. Finishing in second place, close second. All right, is an early American writer, one of the first to achieve international fame, and the only one on this list who can be said to have impacted local history in a way still tangible today. Drawing on his naval experiences, patrolling New York, Raritan, and Sandy Hook Bays, New Jersey's own James Fenimore Cooper is nowadays much better known for Last of the Mohicans than he is for his 1830 novel, The Water Witch, which is also the name of the ship in the novel. Back in the 19th century, however, The novel remained in print for decades and actually generated tourist interest in the area around Sandy Hook and Highlands. In real life, in honor of the Cooper novel and its eponymous ship, local residents named, 1, a northeastern section of Middletown Township, and 2, a fashionable club there after the Cooper novel and its ship. Also named after the novel and ship is a major street, Waterwitch Avenue, in Highlands. And in Highlands, numbers 4 and 5, 2 nearby parallel streets, Barbary and Seadrift Avenues, are named after 2 major characters in the novel. Beginning in Highlands, Miss F.E. Fryett's 1879 article, The Navesink Highlands, in Harper's New Monthly Magazine, September 1879, describes how the local memory of Cooper's novel was still being preserved, or if you prefer, fabricated, some 40 years after its initial publication. In her article, Fryett describes traveling to a fishing village, Parkerstown. From there, as she tells us, a short walk brought us to the scene of Cooper's romantic story of the Water Witch. A tottering chimney, some ruined walls, and a smokehouse in fair preservation are all that remain of the Rust in Lust, where La Belle Barbary and her worthy uncle resided. The pretty Dutch villa with its fantastic chimneys and its picturesque little gables, at that point had recently burned down. To continue with Fryett, the cove where the Water Witch sheltered, and the wood where the skimmer of the seas stole up to the burgher's house with his bales of silks and furs, are still pointed out by the country folk. That's 1879. The burgher's house is the aforementioned Dutch villa, which in the novel is called not Rust in Lust, as Fryett has it, but just the opposite, Lust in Rust. La Belle Barbary is the nickname of Alida de Barbary, a woman whose uncle is the alderman Meindert van Beverhout. He has lost a daughter, Eudora. The epithet skimmer of the seas refers to the captain of the Water Witch, Thomas Tiller, a smuggler who is assisted by Seadrift, in the novel spelled as one word. Now, if classroom experience is relevant, many my students were not happy about having to read this novel. I will just tell you. If classroom experience is relevant, many contemporary readers find Cooper's prose to be challenging, and still fewer may want to read the local geographical references. But perhaps some of the plot and these references may be summarized. The setting is in the 1710s. Much of the description of Sandy Hook occurs in 2 paragraphs near the beginning of chapter 7, paragraphs that might be summarized succinctly by repeating an earlier point, which is that sometimes Sandy Hook has been a peninsula and sometimes it's an island. And at the time of the novel setting, it changes from one to the other, and frequently. Other features of the Sandy Hook area are also described here, including its vegetation, Spermaceti Cove, called the Cove, and the Shrewsbury River, as well as Horseshoe Bight. The intermittent existence of the Shrewsbury Inlet is crucial to the plot, which involves a British embargo against importing goods from the European continent, goods that are nevertheless smuggled by the brigantine Water Witch into East Jersey via the Shrewsbury Inlet, hence the nickname, the skimmer of the seas, for the boat appears to pass through the narrow and shallow inlet, almost as if magically gliding over the peninsula. The embargo authorities cannot stop the Water Witch and cannot catch it either, because it can daringly navigate where they cannot. Coming in at number 1, anyone want to do a drum roll? Okay. Frank R. Stockton. He merits inclusion on the list for 2 works that pertain to Sandy Hook, both of which stayed in print for many years. First, The American Book Company, founded in 1890, was an educational publishing firm, today perhaps best known for publishing the McGuffey Readers. In the late 1890s, the company initiated a state book series entitled Stories from American History. The New Jersey volume was authored by Stockton. By the 1890, a famous author of children's stories, short stories such as The Lady or the Tiger, and novels. His 1896 contribution to the American Book Company series, Stories of New Jersey, remained in print for several years and was later reprinted by Rutgers University Press. In Stockton's book, the seventh story is entitled The Story of Penelope Stout. Stockton's methodology is suggested by his preface and the table of contents. He began by researching the stories using historical works. Quote, "The materials for the stories has been collected from many sources." For the Penelope Stout story, the table of contents indicates Stockton drew upon 4 sources, what he called authorities. He gathered and synthesized the historical facts. Finally, he wrote the story as truthfully as he could. Quote, "In these stories, there is nothing imaginative or fanciful except where a reference is made to the early imaginings and fancies of the Aborigines. The stories are not founded on facts, but they are made up of facts, carefully collected from the authorities referred to in the table of contents. The result is difficult to classify as solely history or literature, since the stories are not founded on facts, but rather made up of them. The Stout story might therefore be categorized as historical fiction, with the publisher's intention of teaching history through literature. The Stout story is set in the period of the Dutch colony New Netherland, before the British ruled New Jersey. It begins with 2 immigrants from Holland, with 20-year-old Penelope Van Princess, her maiden name, and her husband. Their ship wrecks on Sandy Hook. Concerned about the possibility of Indian attacks, the ship's passengers decide to head to New Amsterdam, now New York. But Penelope's husband is too sick and weak to move. Native Americans show up on Sandy Hook and kill him, and then almost kill Penelope, who loses consciousness. While they are eating around a fire, she comes to, crawls away, and finds shelter inside a hollow tree. She hides in the tree, eats the fungi growing nearby, and rekindles the fire to stay warm. The next day, she is out foraging when discovered by 2 Native Americans. They argue about what to do with her, and one of them picks her up and carries her back to her camp, to their camp. The narrator gives the camp's location as, quote, "not far from where Middletown now stands." At the camp, she is treated well, her wounds heal, and she learns the duties of the women in camp. Meanwhile, Dutch settlers return, discover her location, and believe that she's being held hostage. They go to the camp to rescue her, but her supposed captors let her choose between remaining at the camp or leaving with the settlers. She chooses the latter. A year or 2 passes. In New Amsterdam, Penelope marries Englishman Richard Stout. Of him, the narrator says, he afterward became an important personage. For, quote, "he with other settlers went over to New Jersey and founded a little village which was called Middletown, not far from the Indian camp where Penelope had once been a prisoner." The Native American camp is still there, and the man who had carried her there from Sandy Hook years earlier visits her in the nearby village from time to time. During one such visit, he seems troubled and admits plans are underway to attack the village. Now married and with 2 small children, Penelope realizes that she cannot hide as she once had done by herself out on Sandy Hook. The Native American man tells her he had set up for her a canoe that she and her family could use to escape the attack and travel to New Amsterdam. and he urges her and her family to prepare to leave. Penelope then tells her husband, Richard, about the impending attack, but he thinks it's just a rumor. Penelope disagrees. She brings her children to the canoe. They board it, and with Penelope paddling, they set out for New Amsterdam. Realizing what his wife has done, Richard convenes the villagers of Middletown, and they agree to prepare for the attack, which later starts around midnight when they hear war whoops. Richard and some villagers call for a parley with the attackers and inform them that if they were to attack, then, quote, they would find that they would have to do a good deal of hard fighting before they could destroy the village of Middletown. The Indians consider this, and now let us allow the narrator to tell the story. The Indians made up their mind that instead of endeavoring to destroy the inhabitants of Middletown, they would shake hands with them and make a treaty of peace. The whites agreed to buy the lands on which they had built their town, and an alliance was made for mutual protection and assistance. Middletown grew and flourished. In a kind of epilogue, the narrator says that the Stouts also grew and flourished and founded the Baptist Church in Hopewell, concluding, quote, so the Baptist Church in Hopewell, as well as all the churches in Middletown, owed a great deal to the good Indian who carried poor Penelope to his village and cured her of her wounds, unquote. Thus, except for a few passing references to New Amsterdam, Stockton's story is set mainly in Middletown Township, starting on Sandy Hook, but mainly occurring near and in Middletown Village. During the story, the Native Americans and the white settlers go from being enemies to being friends. However, second, this was arguably not Stockton's first writing about Sandy Hook and Middletown, which seems to have occurred indirectly, but famously 15 years earlier. Stockton's novel, Rudder Grange, first appeared, rudder meaning the part that steers a boat, Grange is a farm hall, so it's kind of a mixture as a name. It first appeared in 1879, and a revised 1885 edition with illustrations boosted the book's popularity. The novel stayed in print from 1879 until 1928, almost a half century after its initial book publication. Rudder Grange was also not just a novel, but a franchise. The one 1879 novel inspired 3 sequels. The short story collection, Rudder Granger's Abroad and Other Stories, 1891, a little-known short story entitled Pomona's Club, 1893, and the epistolary novel Pomona's Travels, 1894. Some measure of Rudder Grange's popularity may be seen, as we saw with Cooper, through people bringing its fictional setting into real life. There was a Rudder Grange boat club on the Yarra River in Australia between 1904 and 1963. There was an early 20th century Rudder Grange boarding house in Rockland and Roseville, California. There's a Rudder Grange house in Vineyard Haven, Massachusetts. And of course, we can't forget the Stockton Room in the Nutley Public Library, where a 1940s mural depicts Rudder Grange's characters and setting. This entire 50-year franchise actually began 5 years earlier in 1874 with one short story in Scribner's magazine. 5 years later, in the 1879 book, that short story appears as the book's first 2 chapters. The novel is fiction, of course, but in many cases, the fictional details appear to be thinly disguised facts suggesting a local inspiration. The novel begins with a married couple, the unnamed narrator and his wife Euphemia, authors of a home improvement book. Quote, Euphemia and I once wrote a book. This was just before we were married, in which we told young married people how to go to housekeeping and how much it would cost them. In the first few pages, they are living in a New York City apartment, but they're looking for an affordable house. Now, that's in fiction. In real life, the Stocktons, Mr. and Mrs. Stockton, did publish such a book, The Home, Where It Should Be and What to Put in It, 1873, part of Putnam's Handy Book series. Back in the novel, the couple makes, quote, little excursions into the country about the city. One afternoon, we went up the river. They come upon a canal boat being used as a home. If the narrator's fictional geography is based on real geography, up the river is up the Hudson River on the west side of Manhattan until they reach Spoitendoivel Creek, which was then connected to the Harlem River by a small canal. Some sources on Stockton, such as his biographer Martin Griffin, say that this Harlem River canal boat is the one on which the narrator and Euphemia's Rudder Grange was based. This canal boat, though, has already been converted into a home from the novel. The boat was divided inside into rooms, and these were papered and painted and nicely furnished. There was a kitchen, a living room, a parlor, and bedrooms. There were all sorts of conveniences, carpets on the floors, pictures, and everything, at least it seemed to us, to make a home comfortable. Recall that the narrator and Euphemia have written a home improvement book, so they are looking for not an already finished home, but a home that they can fix up. In fact, after the visit, Euphemia declares, "We must have a houseboat." And her husband admits, "I could see no good reason against adopting this plan." So while the narrator and Euphemia visit this first canal boat in the city that has been converted into a home, that is not the second canal boat that later the narrator and Euphemia turn into their home. The question is where the second canal boat was located. That location is revealed in the novel by a friend, Dr. Here, who tells the couple that he has located a suitable canal boat. After some discussion, the narrator asked his friend, "Doctor, where is this canal boat?" The doctor then went into a detailed statement. The boat was stranded on the shore of the Scoldsbury River. Yeah, see, some of you got it already. This is the first clue as to the location of Rudder Grange. Now, one may research a great long while searching for a Scoldsbury River, as I once did in vain, imagining it to be somewhere in New England. Because here Stockton appears to be engaging in wordplay that can be understood if you know your Shakespeare. A scold was a term once applied to wives who were thought by their husbands to be acting unreasonably. A synonym for a scold is a shrew. Yeah, a stock character in comedies. Yes, you got it. Most famously, Katerina in Shakespeare's comedy, The Taming of the Shrew. That is, Stockton's fictional Scoldsbury River may be the real Shrewsbury River. However, back in the novel again, the narrator's friend, the doctor, hasn't yet finished his sentence, which provides a second clue as to the canal boat's location. The boat was stranded on the shore of the Scoldsbury River, not far below Jinx's. We will get to the preposition below perhaps in a moment, but let's start with Jinx's as the novel situates it in the setting. Jinx's is mentioned a few times in the following pages. It is a hotel. It has a restaurant. There's a little store by it. It's near both a train station and a steamboat landing on a ferry route that connects to the city, transportation necessary for the narrator to continue working at his job at the city. Once again, Stockton appears to be engaging in wordplay because in real life around that time, there was a hotel with a similar name overlooking the Shrewsbury River. Jenkinson's Hotel, Jenks for short, which flourished circa 1868 to 1879. According to J.H. Schenck, writing in 1868, the hotel began as a roadside inn earlier than 1812, passed through two members of the Schenck family before its fourth owner, a Mr. Downs, renovated it and in 1865 leased it to Charles Jenkinson, originally from Long Branch. Schenck says that in 1868, Jenkinson, quote, is remodeling and greatly enlarging the house, increasing it to a capacity of 700 by the following season, 1869. But later in Schenck's guide, Jenkinson's Hotel placed a half-page ad, giving its current capacity while under construction as 250 guests. And I apologize, I can't get you images that can go on YouTube, but you'll have to trust me on what follows. As for the location of Jenkinson's Hotel, in terms of north-south orientation, in F.W. Beers's 1873 Atlas of Monmouth County, the specific Highlands map shows Jenkinson's Hotel immediately to the south of the Highland Drawbridge over the Shrewsbury River. Across the bridge from the hotel was the Highland Beach Railroad Station. This is consistent with the novel's description of fictional jinxes being near the river and a train station. Also in Beers's Highlands map, just south of the hotel, a projected east-west road leading from the river up to a house of a Mrs. Murray seems to align with today's Hillside Avenue. South of that road, a small building is labeled store, consistent with fictional Euphemia's description. In terms of east-west orientation, Beers's Highlands map shows Jenkinson's Hotel as being downhill and east of Twin Lights. Highlands historian John P. King presents an old picture of the hotel, Wicked Tales from the Highlands, page 16, from a position just south of the bridge, looking west up towards the Twin Lights visible in the background. To sum up then, Stockton's fictional jinxes may be the real-life Jenkinson's Hotel in Highlands, then part of Middletown Township. To sum up, if the two fictional locations of the Scoldsbury River and jinxes are based on the real locations of the Shrewsbury River and Jenkinson's Hotel, then another question is whether there is any record in the 1860s or 1870s of a real canal boat converted to a house in the immediate vicinity. Improbably there is. In George Houghton's magazine article about Sandy Hook, he starts from the New Jersey Southern Railroad station near Horseshoe Cove and walks south along the shoreline. He notices something, what looks like a shipwreck. Quote, the first object of special interest that we approach is a wrecked canal boat, standing erect in the sand, broadside on, 20 feet above the high water mark. Houghton thinks it's just a shipwreck, but walks around the other side of it and sees evidence of residents, fishing gear, indications of chickens, and a cow. Houghton writes, surely someone must live here, we said, and knocked at a door. A pleasant-faced German woman opened it, and after some preliminaries, we asked permission to go inside, which was granted. Here was a furnished dwelling with 4 rooms and occupied by 2 families. There are at least 4 boys. Houghton then describes the inside of the canal boat home, a fully furnished kitchen, a storeroom, a bedroom, prints hanging on the walls, a clock, a small library. Houghton writes, within, everything is comfortable and clean. He says, the barge's painted name on the stern has faded but is still visible. While he does not give the name, he does say that the barge was from the Delaware and Hudson Canal. This part of the article contains a large illustration showing the exterior of the canal boat converted into a home, as well as an inset depiction of the interior, a mother with an infant and a child, and a cat in the window. Below the illustration, the caption reads, a rudder Grange at Sandy Hook. So, by Houghton's article, possibly at least as early or even earlier than 1878, a canal boat was converted into a home near the southern part of Horseshoe Cove on Sandy Hook. And the writer of the article's caption called it A. Rudder Grange, the same name that the narrator and Euphemia give their canal boat home, and the same name as Stockton's book title, which launched a franchise that was nationally and internationally famous. His novel's narrator claims familiarity with an area that contains a Scoldsbury River, a Jinx's Hotel, and several other features, all of which seem to correlate with real local geography and local history. Perhaps from the nearby train, did Stockton and his wife see the Sandy Hook Canal boat prior to his writing this story in 1874? Some additional light might be shed by the novel's manuscript, which has been preserved at Harvard, and I hope to examine it someday. Thank you. Tom, do we have time for questions?
Sure.
Okay, will do. Yes, Randy.
You spoke of the New Jersey's James Fenimore Cooper. What's his New Jersey background? I associate him with upstate New York.
And well, you should. However, he was born in downtown Burlington City and lived in Burlington for his first 6 months. So he has a very tenuous claim to being in New Jersey. Yes, technically. There's, I believe, a turnpike rest stop that's named after him. That's nearby. And that's why. There are also other members of the Cooper family. Some of you know the Cooper River flows through Camden. So they were a family from that area.
You were very diplomatic referring to his prose as challenging. I was going to ask you if it's readable.
You know, there was a part here that I was going to read, Randy, and I decided to skip it. But I will. Yes, absolutely.
I love Mark Twain.
He is, but that doesn't mean that he's wrong. Okay, so part of what I cut out here, Randy, was this. Perhaps Cooper is being a little hard on himself. He actually criticized himself for writing the novel. The book ambitiously attempts to blend 3 subgenres: a historical novel, at which Cooper was sometimes quite talented, with a seafaring novel, a subgenre of which Cooper is regarded as a founder, with also a romantic novel, which is probably one ingredient too many. And there are other issues with the novel that are visible from the perspective in the 21st century. Those who read Cooper's prose may well be advised to first consult Mark Twain's lecture on Cooper's literary offenses. Some dialogue is written in semi-Elizabethan English. Some is written in French without translation, and some is written in franglais. There is some shockingly casual racism. The novel does contain action, smuggling adventures, romance, and a cross-dressing sailor whose identity I don't want to reveal in case you read the novel. So Cooper is writing at a time when people believed in much longer sentences than they do now. And even that's a problem. But that with the semi-Elizabethan English like thee and thou, it's tough. It's tough. My students, I think we spent 3 weeks on it, and my students resented, I think, all of it. So, yes.
Where the said Jinx's Hotel was, right now they have I think it's Off the Hook restaurant behind it. I remember as a young man, they used to have a very old hotel, all white, and then it got torn down. I don't remember the name, but it was a famous hotel and restaurant at the time around the, I'm gonna say,
where those condos are now?
not where the condos are, a little bit where the parking lot is for the restaurant, right up against the hill, it was a big hotel and a big restaurant, had big windows, white, it was all old white. I remember, but I don't think it's not the same hotel, but another one. I believe was maybe 50 years ago when it was torn down. No.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the location of the hotel, but kind of correlating current day. Yeah, correlating current maps with historical ones. This was another part that I cut, so I'll just read it. The available evidence seems to put Jenkinson's hotel at approximately what was recently, going from north to south, a Bars and Moby's restaurant satellite parking lot, formerly the Careless Navigator, if any of you remember that one, and number 16 and number 30 Portland Road. So it was immediately south of the older bridge, and the older bridge was aligned more with, I think it's called Highland Avenue.
The Careless Navigator had the best crab sandwiches.
Yes,
Comment and question.
okay, sure.
I was an English major class 8. This was a long time ago, but I do recall reading Twain's Savaging where James Fenimore Cooper. And I think I also remember some writer, and I can't remember who it was, might have been a textbook editor, but he came to Cooper's defense. Some other contemporary writer came and said, look, okay, and Twain was criticizing for logical inconsistencies and last Mohicans and things that don't make sense in terms of the plot. And this writer was very fair, and he exposed a big hole in Huckleberry Finn, which I love. And could be the all-time definitive great American novels.
Okay, so the
Jim keep floating farther and farther, not further. Further is time to read, farther is physical distance. Farther into slave territory, and seemingly, and then they got involved in adventures with those two charlatans, the king and the prince, remember? And they keep going deeper and deeper. And this is after they passed Cairo, Illinois, where they meant to get Jim off the into free territory, not slave. They keep going farther and farther down there. It's like, are we going to get Jim back to free territory at some point?
so the comment, just for the audience who's listening at home, is about how fair Mark Twain is, and the extent to which his own writing is capable of being similarly criticized. Yeah, one of the things Twain talks about is that Cooper's logic of how things work is flawed, but he also complains about the style. One of the valuable qualities of that Twain lecture, it's entitled The Literary Offenses of Fenimore. Oh no, Fenimore Cooper's Literary Offenses. He gives a list of things that writers should do. And one of them is eschew surplusage, which means don't use any more words than is necessary, but it illustrates the point. The specific point you raise is an interesting one in Mark Twain's scholarship, because for many years, the scholars had the first half of the manuscript and nobody knew where the second half was. And I want to say it was around 1993, 94, 95, the second half was discovered. And it was found that there was about a 7-year time lag at the point at which they hit Cairo, Illinois. And so at least the first lecture that I heard about it way back then was the first scholar who was able to look at the manuscript, said he wasn't sure what he should do from that point, because it was not logical for them to try and go upstream the Ohio. Yeah, and so his solution is just kick it down the road. Yeah, and had they landed in Cairo, Jim would have been captured. So the only way to keep the adventure going was to let gravity have its course.
I was in Minneapolis, St. Paul, it was Fort Snow. That's where the Creek bounty hunters got Dred Scott. Dred Scott had made it all the way up to Minnesota, not Cairo across the river from Kentucky and slave territory. He's in Minnesota, and they tried.
Yes, after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, escaping enslaved people had to go up into southern Canada. They were not safe even in the northern states.
I did have a question.
Okay.
Lengthy commentary. Didn't need- It's, later than I want, but Stockton, I'm figuring it has to be related to the Richard Stockton, who was the signer of the Declaration.
He is. I think they were like cousins in some way, or second cousins. Yeah, there was Richard Stockton, his wife, Annis Stockton, Annis Boudinot Stockton, was actually a notable colonial era poet. When I teach her, she actually writes a song to, or a poem to one of her friends, asking her to come to New Brunswick, which is where she lived at the time. And I point to it as the first example of a poem about New Jersey tourism.
The family Stockton is known for their surveying business. In fact, the elder Stockton has passed this year, but they were known for surveying in our area.
Hmm.
Outside of the country.
Interesting.
So
Yeah.
Frank was happy.
He was. When he got married, 1860, it was in Burlington. The family had been living in Philadelphia. And then he moved further north to, I think it was Nutley first and then Convent Station. So Nutley considers him a native, which is why they named the Stockton Reading Room after him and hung the painting. Yeah, yeah. And that dates back to, I think, 1942, the mural. Still there, as far as I know. So, yes.
Thank you for great presentation. I appreciate it. How did you find some of the more obscure pieces that you talked about that I would somewhat obscure?
Wow. Well, once upon a time in spring 2011, I did that graduate course on Northern Coastal Monmouth County literature. And I was kind of doing a lot of research and scouring and exactly looking for some of those obscure writers. As I said in the outset, when I try to look at literary history, I try to realize there are writers, Stockton is a very good example, who were important at the time, but now nobody knows about them. And there are ones who are even more obscure. So some of what I did in terms of the research is that there's an old anthology by Eugene Musgrove entitled Poems of New Jersey, and he did a lot of homework. So you might have heard me mention his name a couple of times in the presentation. He not only selected and presented the poems, but he has some very helpful notes in the back. So that was helpful to me. And then the other thing is, my goodness, isn't the internet sometimes a wonderful invention? You can find all kinds of things that you weren't even looking for. I was looking for Rudder Grange, the novel, and I came across the documentary about the Australian Boat Club. You know, that's an example. That's just a matter of fortune favoring the prepared mind. If I hadn't been researching the novel, that detail would have been meaningless. But instead, it's proof of the international scope of the novel's reputation. Yes, Randy.
You speak so eloquently of the developing South story, and in doing so, what is your take on the relative breakdown of history, Stockton's fiction, and folklore? And the second part of the question, the first written account of Penelope South was the 1790 Samuel Smith History of New Jersey. So are you uncomfortable with a 1660s story not being recorded until 1790?
Well, let me, I guess, try and answer both of those. What I did was summarize the story and specifically the plot. There are a lot of elements. For example, when Penelope has to decide between staying with the Native Americans who have treated her so kindly or going off with the Dutch back to New Amsterdam, that takes the better part of a page where she's thinking through that. So some of it is Stockton's skills as a storyteller. I mean, I appreciate your kind comments towards me, but the eloquence is Stockton's. So he's trying to bring these characters to life and get you to feel about them. And to do that, he's drawing on either his own imagination or his imaginative sympathy. So I would say as you read through it, some parts might be more historical, and I'll put that in quotation marks for now, and some are more literary. But that was the intent of the series, which was not to teach the facts in say, a chronology or a chronicle, but rather to dramatize them so that kids would remember them. I think that was also the function of the illustrations as well. Now, as to your other point, I agree with you. That's why I put quotation marks around history. I think by the time the story was written down, that was a transcription of family folklore. And that's not necessarily historically reliable. And maybe I give Stockton a pass. He's not a historian. Yeah, she hides in the tree in his story. Yeah, on Sandy Hook. So, and Stockton cites Smith as his source, but I don't think he was actually using Smith from 1765. There was an 1890 reprint that was done by the state of New Jersey. There was and even later on, a reprint of that. So, but I think he was using the 1890 New Jersey state reprint of it. And yeah. I think a lot of it was apocryphal. You know, you have a story and there is perhaps some grain or kernel of truth to it. And what happens because nobody passes it down is people just add to the story over time. So the historicity, as we might call it, of the story is in doubt to my mind. But Stockton telling the story and making a big deal out of especially Middletown Township that get mentioned repeatedly, that I think is pretty interesting, especially in a book that's intended for kids. So he's not writing it for adults.
When you have a good story, don't let the facts get in the way.
That's right. That's right.
The legend of Liberty of Jimmy Stewart movie in '63. The legend of not Banker Dan's house, not but the Jimmy Stewart movie in the '60s. Print when you have a choice between the real story and the legend, print the legend.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of those in Stockton's book. One that I found particularly entertaining was the story of Tempe Wick up in Morristown, who is being pursued by a British soldier who wants to take her horse. So she brings it upstairs in her house and hides it. Yeah, Temperance Wick is her first name, Tempe, and that's in the same book, Stories of New Jersey.
What's very interesting, when I saw some of the geographical maps that you have there, I've been a sailor for over almost 56 years in the Bay Area here, and you can see Horseshoe Cove many, many years ago was a horseshoe, and now it's changed. Only you can see that low tide. Spermaceti Cove, you say, why is there whaling? Well, we had a lot of whales in this area during that time. Now we see whales within the Sandy Hook area that we've never seen before. The water's getting cleaner, but it's amazing how history and the printed word and some of the pictures show what was there, and you see the fruition and you see the change. And you can see the truth behind these old pictures and words. It changes. You see it when you're old person like me.
Yeah, well, it's interesting even to look at it either in terms of maps or written accounts. One of the things I enjoyed was this debate about exactly when was the Shrewsbury Inlet. Because you read most accounts and they say, well, it was open in this year and then it was closed and then it was open again and then it was closed again. So going back and forth. And so Cooper's novel takes advantage of that. It appears as though at the time of the novel in the 1710s that the inlet's passable at high tide. And maybe that's the secret to the water witch being able to skim across.
It's like the bar back in Maine.
Mhm.
The C Street is running well.
There is actually a book entitled Whaling in New Jersey. So if you're interested, that might be something to look up. Any other questions?
The library is closing in 30 minutes.